The forgotten alien. Tizia sat in the corner of the massive alien trade station, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Her tall, slender figure and glowing violet eyes made her look otherworldly, but no one spared her a second glance. To the aliens rushing through the station, she was invisible, an outcast, a nobody. Tizia preferred it that way. She kept her hood low, hiding her face, hoping to go unnoticed. The station was alive with activity. Bright lights blinked from towering screens, advertising exotic goods from across the galaxy. Merchants shouted about rare crystals, strange foods, and advanced technology. Beings of all shapes, colors, and sizes bargained, argued, and laughed. Amid this chaos, Tizia stayed silent, her sharp gaze scanning for threats. Ethan, a human engineer, wandered through the station, his eyes wide with curiosity. Humans were rare visitors here, but Ethan wasn't intimidated. He was fascinated by alien technology and often came to the station to find parts for his ship. Today, he was looking for a special energy core, but something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. In the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed her. She wasn't like the other aliens. There was something about the way she moved, quiet and deliberate, as if she were hiding from the world. Her silver skin shimmered softly, and an aura surrounded her, a faint energy field that seemed to ripple like heat waves. Ethan stopped in his tracks. No one else seemed to notice her, but Ethan couldn't look away. Curiosity burned inside him. Who was she? Why was she sitting alone, ignored by everyone? Before he could stop himself, Ethan walked toward her. His boots clicked against the metallic floor, drawing her attention. Tizia's violet eyes snapped up to meet his. For a moment, they stared at each other. She seemed surprised that someone had noticed her. Ethan hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Hi," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "Are you okay?" Tizia didn't respond. She tilted her head, studying him like he was an unfamiliar creature. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Go away." Ethan frowned. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need help," she said quickly. "Especially not from a human." Her words stung, but Ethan didn't back off. Instead, he sat on a nearby bench, keeping his distance. "You don't look like you're doing great," he said casually. "You're hiding something." Tizia stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of her cloak. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Ethan admitted. "But I can tell when someone's in trouble." Tizia's lips tightened into a thin line. She wanted to get up and leave, but something about this human made her stay. He wasn't like the others, loud, arrogant, or dismissive. He was quiet, calm, and strangely persistent. "You shouldn't be here," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you knew what I could do, you'd run." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Tizia's eyes flickered with something. Fear, anger, maybe both. "You don't want to know," she said. "It's better if you pretend you never saw me." Ethan shook his head. "That's not how I work. If you're in danger, maybe I can help." Tizia laughed bitterly. "Help? You're just a human. What could you possibly do?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't get angry. Instead, he said, "Humans are good at figuring things out. You'd be surprised." Before Tizia could respond, a loud voice interrupted them. "There she is." Both of them turned. A towering alien with glowing red eyes and sharp claws was pointing at Tizia. Behind him, two other aliens armed with blasters were closing in. Tizia's breath caught, and Ethan felt the tension in the air. "Stay back," Tizia warned Ethan, standing up quickly. Her hood fell, revealing her full face. She was stunning, but her expression was filled with panic. The red-eyed alien growled. "The council wants you dead, Tizia. You shouldn't have come here." Ethan stood up, stepping between Tizia and the aliens. "What's going on?" he demanded. Tizia grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "This is why I told you to leave," she hissed, But before she could pull him away, something strange happened. The moment her hand touched Ethan, his mind was flooded with images. He saw flashes of alien worlds burning, battles in the sky, and Tizia standing alone in the middle of the chaos. He saw her being dragged before an alien council, their voices echoing. "She is too dangerous. Exile her." Ethan gasped and stumbled back, breaking the connection. What was that?" he stammered. Tizia stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "How did you see that?" she whispered. "No one else can." The red-eyed alien snarled. "Enough talking. Hand her over." Tizia's hands began to glow with a strange energy, and the air around her crackled. "Ethan," she said urgently, "if you want to live, stay behind me." Ethan looked at her, then at the advancing aliens. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's get out of here." The aliens charged, but Tizia raised her hands, and a burst of energy shot out, sending them flying. She grabbed Ethan's hand and ran, her mind racing. She didn't know why this human could see her memories, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to lose him now. The hidden power. The stolen ship trembled as it shot through the endless void of space. Ethan gripped the controls tightly, sweat forming on his brow. The blinking warning lights on the dashboard told him they were running on borrowed time. Behind him, Tizia sat with her head lowered, her hands glowing faintly, as if struggling to contain something dangerous. "You didn't tell me they'd chase us with a battleship," Ethan snapped, glancing back at her. Tizia didn't answer immediately. Her glowing violet eyes were locked on her trembling hands. "They're not after you," she finally said, her voice hollow. "They're after me. And I told you to leave." Ethan sighed, his patience thinning. "Yeah, well, I've got this bad habit of helping people who don't ask for it. Now, care to explain what just happened back there? What are you?" Tizia looked up sharply, her expression torn between anger and fear. "You wouldn't understand," she muttered. "Try me." Ethan shot back, guiding the ship through a debris field with a quick jerk of the controls. Tizia hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I wasn't always like this. My people called me a gifted. It's rare, maybe one in a million. We can manipulate energy, bend it, shape it. At least, that's what they thought I could do. But they were wrong." "Wrong how?" Ethan asked, his curiosity growing despite the tension. Tizia's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not energy I control. It's reality itself." Ethan froze for a moment, his hand hovering over the controls. "Reality," he repeated, disbelief thick in his tone. "You're saying you can, what? Rewrite the rules of the universe?" Tizia nodded slowly, her glowing hands clenching into fists. "In theory. But I can't control it. My powers are unstable, unpredictable. The council feared I would destroy everything, so they exiled me. And now they've sent bounty hunters to finish the job." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. "If they're scared of you, why haven't you used your powers to fight back?" Tizia laughed bitterly. "Do you think I haven't tried? Every time I use it, something breaks. A planet's gravity destabilizes, a star collapses, a person disappears. My power is a curse, not a weapon." Ethan processed her words in silence, his eyes scanning the star-speckled void ahead. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. Tizia wasn't the monster her people believed her to be. She was scared, alone, and desperate to control something far beyond her understanding. A loud alarm snapped him back to the present. The ship shuddered violently as a blast from the pursuing battleship skimmed their hull. "We've got company," Ethan muttered, gripping the controls tightly. "Can you do something about this? Maybe bend reality so we're not about to be blown to pieces." Tizia's jaw tightened. "I told you, I can't control it. If I try, I might make things worse." Ethan glanced back at her, his eyes determined. "Look, you don't have to be perfect. Just give us a chance." Tizia hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. Then she closed them, taking a deep breath. The glow around her hands intensified, and the air inside the ship grew heavy, almost electric. Outside, the battleship prepared another shot, its massive cannons glowing with deadly energy. But just as it fired, the space around the ship seemed to ripple and twist. The blast curved unnaturally, missing them entirely and disappearing into the void. Ethan's eyes widened. "You did it." Tizia's breath came in short gasps, her hands shaking violently. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice weak. "It's starting." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the ship's navigation system went haywire. The stars outside the cockpit blurred and stretched, as if the fabric of space itself were unraveling. Ethan struggled to keep the ship steady, but it felt like they were being pulled in every direction at once. "Tizia, what's happening?" he shouted. "I can't stop it," she cried, her glowing hands gripping the edges of her seat. "The energy, it's feeding on itself. It's going to tear us apart." Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. He had no idea how to deal with someone who could bend reality, let alone fix whatever was happening. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now. "Focus," he yelled over the chaos. "You're stronger than this. You can control it." Tizia's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, they glowed brighter than ever. She clenched her fists, drawing the chaotic energy back into herself. The ship steadied, and the stars outside returned to their normal positions. The air grew calm again. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. Tizia shook her head, her body slumping with exhaustion. "No, I just delayed the inevitable." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, but before she could answer, the ship's sensors beeped loudly. A holographic display lit up, showing a massive fleet of alien ships closing in on their position. Tizia's face paled. "It means they found us," she whispered. Ethan tightened his grip on the controls. "Then I hope you've got more tricks up your sleeve, because this is about to get a lot worse." Escape and trust. The stolen ship careened through a dense asteroid field, its hull groaning under the strain of sudden maneuvers. Ethan's hands danced over the controls, his sharp eyes locked on the jagged rocks rushing toward them. Every few seconds, he threw a quick glance at Tizia, who sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hood pulled low over her face. She looked calm, but her glowing hands betrayed her nerves. "I don't suppose you can bend reality to get us out of this mess?" Ethan asked, his voice strained as he dodged another asteroid. Tizia shot him a glare. "You want me to try that here? In an asteroid field? Do you enjoy the thought of spontaneous black holes?" Ethan grunted, yanking the controls to the side to avoid a massive boulder. "Fair point." Behind them, the alien bounty hunter's ship stayed locked on their tail. Its sleek black hull glinted menacingly in the dim light of the asteroid field. Blasts of plasma fired from its cannons, each shot shaking the smaller ship as it narrowly avoided destruction. Tizia's fingers dug into the armrest, her glowing violet eyes scanning the holographic display. "They're not going to stop," she muttered. "They won't stop until I'm dead." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his mind focused on the impossible task of keeping them alive. But her words lingered in his ears, the way she said them, so resigned, so hopeless, made his stomach twist. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of soldiers who'd given up, in refugees who'd lost everything. "Well," Ethan said finally, "they'll have to kill me first, and I'm pretty hard to kill." Tizia blinked, caught off guard by his calm confidence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why didn't you just leave me back there?" Ethan snorted. "What? And let a bunch of trigger-happy aliens take you out? Not my style." "You don't even know me," Tizia said, her voice low. "You don't know what I've done." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "I know enough. I know you're not the monster they think you are." Tizia opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden jolt threw them both forward. The ship's console lit up with alarms, and Ethan cursed under his breath. A quick glance at the readings told him the bounty hunter's latest shot had grazed their engines. "We're losing thrust," Ethan said, his hands flying over the controls. "I need to find a place to land and make repairs. Got any ideas?" Tizia stared at the holographic map, her mind racing. Then she pointed to a small, uncharted moon just ahead. "There, it's uninhabited. We can hide." "Hide?" Ethan echoed, steering the ship toward the moon. "You don't strike me as the hiding type." "I'm not," Tizia said, her tone sharp. "But right now, it's our only option. Unless you prefer to be vaporized." Ethan grinned despite the situation. "Hiding it is." The ship descended toward the moon, its engines sputtering and groaning with every movement. The surface of the moon was barren and rocky, its gray landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. Ethan landed the ship in a deep canyon, the walls high enough to shield them from prying eyes. The moment the engines powered down, Tizia stood and headed toward the exit. Ethan caught her arm. "Where are you going?" "To scout," she said simply. "If they find us here, we need a plan." Ethan shook his head. "You're exhausted. Rest first." Tizia pulled her arm free, her violet eyes flashing. "I don't need your concern, human." Ethan crossed his arms, blocking her path. "You might not need it, but you've got it anyway. So sit down before you pass out." Tizia hesitated, her pride warring with her fatigue. Finally, she sank back into the co-pilot's seat, muttering something under her breath. Ethan chuckled and moved to the engine bay, grabbing his tools. As he worked, Tizia watched him silently. She'd spent so long being hunted, so long trusting no one, that Ethan's unwavering loyalty baffled her. He didn't know her, didn't understand the chaos she carried inside her, yet he stayed. Why? What did he see in her that her own people couldn't? "I don't understand you," she said suddenly. Ethan glanced up from his tools. "What's there to understand?" "You don't know what I'm capable of," Tizia said, her voice tinged with frustration. "You don't know the damage I could cause." Ethan leaned against the wall, wiping grease from his hands. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I've seen enough to know you're not the villain of this story. And until you give me a reason to think otherwise, I'm sticking around." Tizia stared at him, unsure how to respond. She wanted to argue, to push him away. But deep down, a small part of her wanted to believe him. Could it really be that simple? Could someone see her as more than a threat? Before she could say anything, the ship's sensors beeped loudly. Ethan rushed to the console, his stomach sinking as the display lit up with red dots. "They found us," he said grimly. Tizia stood, her hands already glowing with energy. "Then we fight." Ethan smiled faintly. "Now you're speaking my language." The bounty hunter's ship descended into the canyon, its weapons primed and ready. Ethan and Tizia exchanged a quick glance, an unspoken agreement passing between them. They didn't trust each other completely, not yet, but for now, they were in this together. And that was enough. The artifact's secret. The air was thin and still on the desolate surface of Tizia's home planet. Jagged black mountains stretched endlessly under a pale, dying sun. The ground beneath Ethan's boots crunched like broken glass, the remnants of a civilization long gone. He adjusted his breathing mask, glancing over at Tizia. She walked ahead, her movements precise and silent, her glowing violet eyes scanning the horizon. "This place doesn't exactly scream welcome back," Ethan said, his voice muffled by the mask. Tizia didn't look at him. "It's not supposed to. They left it like this to remind anyone who dares return what happens to outcasts." Ethan frowned, noting the faint tremor in her voice. "Your people did this, to their own planet. They didn't need it anymore," Tizia replied flatly. "Not after the artifact was buried here." Ethan quickened his pace to walk beside her. "You've been pretty vague about this artifact. What exactly is it?" Tizia stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "It's what makes me this way," she said, her tone sharp. "It's where my power comes from. They said it was ancient, something from before our time. When I was born, it connected to me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Connected? Like it chose you?" Tizia shrugged, her glowing hands flexing unconsciously. "Or cursed me. Depends who you ask." Before Ethan could respond, his scanner beeped. He glanced at the screen on his wrist. "We're close," he said. "The energy signature is off the charts." Tizia nodded and started walking again, her steps faster now. They descended into a deep canyon, the walls narrowing as they went. Strange symbols were etched into the rock, glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan paused to examine them, running his fingers over the markings. "Your people left these?" he asked. "They're warnings," Tizia said without looking back, "for anyone foolish enough to come here." Ethan smirked. "Guess that makes us fools, huh?" Tizia didn't laugh. Instead, she stopped in front of a massive stone door embedded in the canyon wall. It was smooth and seamless, with no visible way to open it. But as Tizia raised her hand, the symbols on the door began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the energy radiating from her. "This is it," she said softly. "The artifact is behind here." Ethan stared at the door, then at her. "And what happens when we open it?" Tizia's expression darkened. "I don't know. No one's ever survived touching it." Ethan blinked. "Wait, hold on. What do you mean survived? You said it connected to you." "It did," Tizia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but only because I was a child. My body adapted to it. Anyone else?" She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So we're risking instant death for this thing." "You don't have to be here," Tizia said, her tone colder than before. "You can leave." Ethan looked at her, his jaw tightening. "We've been over this. I'm not going anywhere." Tizia hesitated, then nodded. Without another word, she pressed her hands against the door. The glowing symbols flared to life, and the ground beneath them began to shake. Ethan staggered, grabbing the canyon wall for support as the door slowly slid open with a low rumble. Beyond the door was a vast chamber, its walls lined with more glowing symbols. At the center of the room, hovering above a pedestal, was the artifact. It was a sphere of swirling energy, its surface constantly shifting and pulsing with light. Ethan felt its power immediately, a pressure in the air, like standing in the eye of a storm. Tizia stepped forward, her movements cautious. The artifact reacted to her presence, its glow intensifying. She reached out a trembling hand, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a shockwave rippled through the chamber, throwing her back. "Tizia!" Ethan shouted, rushing to her side. She groaned, her body trembling as the artifact's energy pulsed wildly. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, casting eerie shadows. "I'm fine," Tizia said through gritted teeth, pushing herself up. "It's testing me." "Testing you?" Ethan echoed, glancing nervously at the artifact. "What does that even mean?" "It's alive," Tizia said, her voice shaky. "It knows me, but it doesn't trust me anymore. I have to prove I can control it." Before Ethan could respond, the chamber filled with a sharp metallic hum. He turned to see a swarm of alien drones descending from the ceiling, their sleek bodies gleaming and their weapons locking onto Tizia. "Well, that's just fantastic," Ethan muttered, drawing his plasma pistol. He fired at the nearest drone, blasting it out of the air. "Any chance you can bend reality and get rid of these things?" Tizia's hands began to glow brighter, and the air around her crackled with energy. "I'll try," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The drones opened fire, their shots ricocheting off the walls as Ethan and Tizia fought back. Ethan's movements were quick and precise, his engineering skills giving him an edge as he used the environment to his advantage. Meanwhile, Tizia unleashed bursts of energy, her power shaking the chamber with every strike. But as the drones kept coming, the artifact's glow grew more unstable. The symbols on the walls began to shift, as if the entire chamber was alive and responding to the conflict. "Ethan," Tizia shouted over the noise. "If this goes wrong." "It won't," Ethan interrupted, firing another shot. "We'll figure it out. Together." Tizia hesitated, then nodded. She turned back to the artifact, her hands glowing brighter than ever. The drones closed in, but Ethan stood his ground, protecting her as she reached for the artifact one last time. The moment her hands touched it, the chamber erupted in light, and everything went still. A human's potential. The silence after the explosion was deafening. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, blinking away the blinding light that had filled the chamber moments ago. His ears rang, and his body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had doubled. He glanced around. The alien drones lay in smoldering heaps, their sleek forms reduced to lifeless shells. The glowing symbols on the walls were dim, flickering faintly, as if the chamber itself had been drained of energy. At the center of it all stood Tizia, her silver skin shimmering faintly in the eerie light of the artifact. But something was different now. The artifact hovered inches above her hands, its swirling energy crackling like a living storm. And then Ethan realized she wasn't holding it. It was holding her. "Tizia," Ethan called, his voice hoarse. He stumbled to his feet, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor. "What's happening?" Tizia didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her face tense, as though she were in the middle of an impossible battle. The artifact's energy pulsed, sending waves of power rippling through the air. Ethan felt the hairs on his arms stand on end, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. And then her eyes snapped open. "I can't hold it," she gasped, her voice shaking. The energy around her flared, wild and uncontrollable. "It's too much. It's rejecting me." Ethan's heart pounded. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. Tizia was in trouble. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The moment their hands touched, the artifact reacted. Its energy surged, and a blinding light enveloped them both. Ethan felt a searing heat, followed by a strange, cold calm. His vision blurred, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. He stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by stars that pulsed like living things. In front of him floated the artifact, its energy now calm and steady. Beside him, Tizia appeared, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing in the void. Tizia shook her head. "I don't know. This has never happened before." The artifact pulsed, and Ethan felt something brush against his mind. An alien presence, vast and ancient. It wasn't speaking, not in words, but he understood it nonetheless. It was testing him, probing his thoughts, his memories, his intentions. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but he didn't back down. The presence shifted, and Ethan suddenly saw flashes of Tizia's life. Her childhood, her training, the moment the artifact chose her, and the devastation that followed. He saw her fear, her anger, her loneliness, and then he saw himself, standing beside her, refusing to leave, fighting for her when no one else would. The presence withdrew, and the artifact's energy changed. It wasn't wild or chaotic anymore. It was calm, almost welcoming. Tizia stared at Ethan, her violet eyes wide. "It's choosing you," she whispered, disbelief heavy in her voice. How is that possible?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the artifact's energy was flowing into him, merging with him in a way that felt both natural and overwhelming. His body felt stronger, his mind sharper. He could feel the artifact's power coursing through him, like a river of endless potential. When the void dissolved and reality snapped back into focus, Ethan found himself standing in the chamber again. The artifact floated beside him, its energy now steady and under control. Tizia stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "What just happened?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Tesia took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "You bonded with it," she said, "something no one else has ever done. Not even me." Ethan looked down at his hands. They glowed faintly, the same energy that had once surrounded Tesia now pulsing through him. "I don't understand," he said. "Why me?" Tesia's expression softened, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe because you're too stubborn to give up." Before Ethan could respond, the chamber shook violently. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the walls, and the faint flicker of red light filled the air. Tesia's face hardened. "They're here," she said. Ethan's heart sank as the holographic display on his wrist lit up. The alien bounty hunters' fleet was descending on the planet, their ships blotting out the pale sun. A voice crackled over the comm system. "Tesia of the exiled." The bounty hunter growled. "Surrender the artifact, or we'll reduce this planet to ash." Ethan clenched his fists, the artifact's energy responding to his determination. "Guess they didn't get the memo," he said, his voice laced with defiance. Tesia stepped beside him, her own glow returning as she prepared for the fight ahead. "They think they're ready for us," she said, her voice steady. "They're not." Ethan smirked, the weight of the artifact's power now feeling less like a burden and more like a part of him. "Let's show them what happens when you mess with a human and an outcast." As the ground beneath them trembled and the enemy fleet closed in, Ethan and Tesia stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they were no longer running. Together, they were unstoppable. A dangerous alliance. The alien warship loomed above the horizon, its shadow swallowing the desolate landscape of Tesia's home planet. Its cannons hummed ominously, a promise of destruction waiting to be unleashed. Ethan stood on the ridge, his fists clenched as the energy of the artifact rippled through him. The air around him shimmered faintly, a testament to the power now coursing through his body. Beside him, Tesia's violet eyes scanned the approaching fleet. Her glow was dimmer now, the strain of recent battles weighing on her. Yet there was a fierce determination in her gaze, a refusal to back down, even when the odds were stacked against them. "They'll wipe us out if we stay here," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We need a plan." Tesia tilted her head, her mind racing. "We can't fight them directly. That warship alone has enough firepower to level this planet. But if we can get inside..." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Get inside? You're talking about sneaking onto a ship that's probably crawling with armed aliens." Tesia's lips curved into a faint, almost teasing smile. "Are you scared, human?" Ethan snorted. "Not scared, just not suicidal." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious now. "We don't have a choice. If they take the artifact, they'll use its power to enslave entire civilizations. We can't let that happen." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "All right. But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. No reckless heroics." Tesia smirked. "I didn't peg you for the cautious type." Ethan shrugged. "I like to call it calculated risk." Before they could move, the warship's loudspeakers crackled to life, and the bounty hunter's guttural voice boomed across the canyon. "Tesia, surrender now, and we'll consider sparing your human companion. Resist, and we'll leave nothing but dust." Ethan glanced at Tesia. "They're really fond of their empty threats, aren't they?" "They're not empty," Tesia said grimly. "They'll destroy everything if it means stopping me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then let's make sure they don't get the chance." Inside the ship's cargo hold, chaos reigned. Ethan and Tesia had slipped aboard using a damaged service hatch on the ship's underbelly. The artifact's energy had cloaked them long enough to evade the external sensors, but now they were deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces. Tesia moved like a shadow, her every step silent and deliberate. Ethan followed close behind, his plasma pistol gripped tightly in one hand, while his other hand stayed near the glowing artifact. The energy coursing through him made him feel invincible, but he knew better than to underestimate their enemies. "This way," Tizia whispered, leading him down a narrow corridor. The power core is in the central chamber. If we can disable it, the ship will be grounded. And then what? Ethan asked, his voice equally low. Hope they don't send reinforcements. Tizia glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp. One problem at a time. They turned a corner and found themselves face to face with a patrol of heavily armed aliens. The soldiers froze for a moment, their glowing weapons raising as they registered the intruders. Ethan didn't hesitate. The artifact's energy surged through him as he raised his hand, and a wave of kinetic force rippled outward, slamming the soldiers against the walls. Tizia stepped forward, her hands glowing as she disabled their weapons with a flick of her wrist. That was easier than expected, Ethan said, lowering his hand. Don't get cocky, Tizia replied. The harder part is still ahead. As they approached the central chamber, the air grew heavy with energy. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the ship itself were alive and aware of their presence. Ethan's grip on the artifact tightened, the power within it responding to the charged atmosphere. The door to the power core was massive, its surface covered in glowing alien runes. Tizia stepped forward, her hands hovering over the symbols. She closed her eyes, her energy syncing with the ship's systems. The runes flickered, and the door hissed open. Inside, the core hummed with a blinding white light. It was a massive sphere, suspended in midair by streams of energy. Dozens of alien engineers worked around it, their backs turned to the intruders. Ethan glanced at Tizia, who nodded silently. Together, they moved into the room, their steps careful and quiet. But before they could reach the core, alarms blared, and the engineers turned, weapons drawn. The room erupted into chaos. Ethan unleashed a wave of energy, sending the first wave of attackers flying. Tizia followed, her powers creating a shield that deflected incoming fire. But the engineers weren't the real threat. The bounty hunter stepped into the chamber, his massive frame blocking the only exit. His glowing red eyes locked onto Tizia, and he grinned. "You've caused enough trouble," he growled, raising a massive weapon. "Time to end this." Ethan stepped in front of Tizia, his own energy flaring brightly. "You'll have to go through me first." The bounty hunter laughed, a low guttural sound. A human, protecting an outcast. How predictable. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he focused all his energy on the artifact, its power surging through him. The ground beneath them trembled as the chamber filled with blinding light. "Tizia," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "get to the core. Shut it down." Tizia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Don't die, human." With that, she darted toward the core, her glowing hands reaching for the control panel. The bounty hunter roared, lunging toward her, but Ethan intercepted him, their powers colliding in a violent burst of energy. As Tizia worked frantically to disable the core, the ship's systems began to fail, sparks flying from every surface. The bounty hunter fought with brutal strength, but Ethan held his ground, the artifact's energy fueling him beyond his limits. Finally, Tizia shouted, "It's done. The core is destabilizing." Ethan shoved the bounty hunter back with one final blast of energy, then turned to Tizia. "Time to go." The two of them sprinted out of the chamber, the ship shaking violently as the power core collapsed. Behind them, the bounty hunter's furious roar echoed through the corridors, but they didn't look back. As they reached the escape hatch, Ethan glanced at Tizia. "Next time, let's pick a quieter plan." Tizia smirked, her glow brighter than it had been in days. "Where's the fun in that?" Redemption. The warship was falling apart around them. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and the floor trembled beneath their feet as Ethan and Tizia sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors. The ship's core had been destabilized, and the countdown to total destruction was ticking faster than either of them had anticipated. "This thing's going to blow in less than 5 minutes," Ethan shouted, glancing at the wrist-mounted holographic display flashing red. "Please tell me you've got an exit plan." Tizia's eyes darted around, glowing faintly in the dim light. "There's an emergency shuttle bay, 2 decks up," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "If we can make it there." A deafening roar cut her off. The bounty hunter appeared at the end of the corridor, his armor scorched but still intact. His glowing red eyes locked onto them, and his lips curled into a snarl. "You think you've won," he growled, his voice like grinding metal. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Ethan rolled his eyes. Why do they always have to monologue? The bounty hunter raised a massive, crackling energy weapon, and Tizia shoved Ethan aside just as a bolt of energy tore through the air where he'd been standing. She raised her hands, a shimmering shield of violet energy, materializing between them and their attacker. "You go," she shouted over the sound of crackling energy. "I'll hold him off." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his jaw tightening. "Not a chance. We finish this together." Tizia glared at him, her expression fierce. "Don't be stubborn, human. If we both stay, we'll die. And if I leave you behind, what's the point?" Ethan shot back. "You're not doing this alone." The bounty hunter charged, slamming into the shield with a force that sent shockwaves rippling through the corridor. Tizia gritted her teeth, her hands trembling as she struggled to maintain the barrier. Ethan's mind raced. He could feel the artifact's energy inside him, pulsing like a second heartbeat. If there was ever a time to push it to its limits, it was now. "Tizia," he said, his voice low but firm. "Drop the shield." She looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Are you insane?" "Trust me," Ethan said, his gaze steady. "Just for once, trust me." Tizia hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. She let the shield collapse, and the bounty hunter lunged forward, his weapon raised. But before he could strike, Ethan raised his hands, the artifact's energy surging through him. A wave of blinding light erupted from Ethan, slamming into the bounty hunter and sending him flying down the corridor. The walls cracked and buckled under the force, and the warship groaned as its structural integrity weakened further. Ethan staggered, the energy drain leaving him breathless, but he didn't falter. The bounty hunter struggled to his feet, his armor cracked and sparking. He snarled, his rage palpable. "You'll regret that, human." Ethan smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're welcome to try again, big guy, but I don't think you've got much time left." As if on cue, the ship's alarm blared louder, and another explosion rocked the corridor. The bounty hunter hesitated, torn between revenge and survival. With a final growl, he turned and disappeared into the smoke, his heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled deeply, then turned to Tizia. "Shuttle bay. Now." The emergency shuttle rocketed away from the crumbling warship, its engines roaring as Ethan piloted it through the planet's thin atmosphere. Tizia sat in the co-pilot's seat, her eyes fixed on the rearview display. The warship was a fiery mass of destruction, pieces of it breaking off and plummeting to the surface below. As they reached the edge of the atmosphere, the ship's core finally gave out. The explosion lit up the sky like a second sun, its shockwave rippling outward in a spectacular display of light and energy. Ethan and Tizia shielded their eyes, the small shuttle rattling from the force of the blast. "It's done," Tizia said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad for a human and an outcast, huh?" Tizia let out a tired laugh, the sound surprising even herself. "You're impossible, and you're welcome," Ethan replied with a grin. They fell into a comfortable silence as the shuttle broke free from the planet's gravity, the vast expanse of space stretching out before them. Ethan set the autopilot and leaned back in his seat, the weight of their ordeal finally hitting him. "What now?" he asked, glancing at Tizia. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Then she turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Well, maybe it's time to figure out what you want, not what everyone else expects of you. Tizia smiled faintly. And what about you? What do you want? Ethan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. I want a shower, a good meal, and about 12 hours of sleep. After that, I guess we'll see. Tizia tilted her head, her smile growing. You're not like anyone I've ever met, Ethan. He shrugged, his grin playful. Humans have a habit of being full of surprises. As the shuttle disappeared into the stars, Tizia looked out the window, the weight of her past finally beginning to lift. She wasn't just an outcast anymore. She was something more, something better. And for the first time, she wasn't facing the future alone.